And we are live. Hello and welcome to Fermenting Opinions. I'm your host, David Papiden. And this is Fermenting Opinions, the podcast and Zoom live stream in search of a more palatable political ferment. We are here on November 10th and joined tonight by Warren, Haji, and Haley. Others kind of dropped out at the last minute. Kind of a weird combination of topics we're getting into tonight. The first thing we wanted to talk about was the Rittenhouse testimony that occurred today and the cross-examination, both fairly important events going on. So we're going to talk about that, and then we're going to get into something that's a little bit, and we're going to lose Haley definitely on this conversation, because attention span wise, not that it's above her head, she's much smarter than I am, but we're going to talk about sort of where we are with social media now and where that could be going and sort of the next iteration of that with regards to augmented reality. And if that sounds completely out of left field as compared to what we normally talk about, it's true, it is. But I think it's worth talking about, and we're just going to see how it goes from there. So welcome everybody. How y'all doing?
Doing well. Excited to be here. Thank you for the opportunity.
Awesome. I am making sure that you guys are being picked up by my. Somebody speak real quick. I want to make sure this is working.
Can you hear me?
Okay, cool. All right, we're good. Yeah, I was double checking on the OBS because it wasn't responding the way I wanted it to initially, and I'm also starting stream on Twitch because we're gonna be getting into what the cool kids are doing, and see how that goes. So yeah, so we've got all the bells and whistles running, and yeah.
And cool. I have posted our YouTube live links on the Facebook.
Thank you, Haley, for doing your job. Haley had to do that job tonight, and I appreciate her doing that. She had to do that because I did a thing today on Facebook, and I got zucked for only a week. But a week. I've been zucked because I was talking with a friend of mine about the Rittenhouse trial and how I think he's probably going to walk. And we were joking back and forth somewhat crudely, and the Facebook community standards algorithm doesn't really make a differentiation between sarcasm and an incitement of violence. So if I made a joke about, if you want to make some money, all you got to do is shoot some people, then call them rioters, and then the book deals and the talk show circuit, you're going to make a good bit of money off of that. So that I was kind of giving a trashy hot take, and Facebook didn't like it very much. So yeah. Wah, wah. So Haley had to post the show for me. So thank you, Haley.
I've done it.
You did it. Woohoo! So and Haley, she was giving me updates all day, and it's partially her fault for letting me know that the cross-examination was going on, and I was getting kind of like bitter and irritated about it. So then I started cutting up with a friend of mine.
Don't try to blame me. You need to take ownership.
It's totally my fault. I understand that. But I wanted to throw some shade your way anyway. But so watching the cross-examination, what a weird. Haley, if you would kind of go over some of the high points of it, because you got to watch it all live, and I learned about it from you. So
I didn't make any notes to prepare for this, but one, I'm surprised that they only did it for one day, because I would think that first and foremost, I'm a corporate defense attorney. I don't do criminal law. But I know that a witness taking the stand happens, once, like Haley's Comet comes around. That's around how often you're going to see a defendant who's going to take the witness stand in a murder trial. Like, it just doesn't really happen. Although I say that, however, during our last show, I did say that I thought that Rittenhouse would take the stand in this particular case.
What's the MO? Because he's waiving his Fifth Amendment protections, like that he has a right not to incriminate himself. Anybody doesn't know what that means, and so he did that, and he took the stand, and he got cross-examined, and things got rather emotional and weird, and I don't know if that was part of the plan or not, but like, what was like the strategy going in to allow him to take the stand? Like, if you could guess. I'm not saying you can
Well,
say.
I mean, they needed to they needed to have evidence that they needed to establish what written at issue in this murder trial is self-defense. That's central to the defense of him killing two people and shooting at a third person and shooting and hitting and seriously injuring a fourth person. So central to that is his claim that he felt threatened, and so the best evidence, would come from the person who felt threatened, and they just didn't really have that many other sources to sort of get into the state of mind of Rittenhouse at the time that he fired his AR-15 throughout that night. Yeah. So they also wanted to get, evidence in like testimony evidence establishing that they needed to get evidence establishing that like these guys were arsonists and rioters who were making the a threatening environment, a very hostile environment, and then also that they were attacking Rittenhouse. I would say for the first victim, he said that guy threatened him twice, and I think that the first victim video is the worst looking for Rittenhouse. Like he turns around and just shoots this guy. It's the one that he was at the most greatest risk for being criminally liable for, was definitely the first one, in my opinion. Yeah. So the only evidence that this guy ever verbally threatened him was Rittenhouse's testimony that at two prior occasions in the evening that guy threatened Rittenhouse. So there's never any video, never any audio, and no one else corroborated or said anything about this. So the only place to get that information was Rittenhouse.
So that does kind of make sense, that if you're trying to get that out there, that he was being, having his life threatened. And I did hear that part of the testimony. He was having his life threatened, that like, if there was no other way to get it out there, like you said, then like, what other excuse could be, proffered, because I guess the video itself is pretty ugly.
Yeah. So, so that was a big thing on direct, and just really establishing his state of mind, and the, main thing on cross-examination, which, as it should have been on cross-examination, was pretty much trying to establish as much as possible that Rittenhouse's reaction to this scenario was not reasonable. A reasonable person would not have felt the need to use deadly force to, assuage the situation, to mitigate the risks of whatever that was present. So, I did think that the overall, I would say the prosecution did a decent job. I was kind of surprised how quickly they went through everything. They passed the witness today, so they only did one day, and I just thought that they would get a little deeper on certain things. The judge was holding tight reins the whole time, and I get it. A judge is going to be nervous whenever a criminal defendant in a murder trial takes the stand, just because there's certain constitutional rights that he still hasn't waived just by going, like, you can't talk about his right to remain silent after he was arrested and stuff like that. You still can't get into stuff about attorney-client privilege. There's still certain protections in play, but on the other hand, he got on the stand. you gotta let him. So I kind of thought he held his reins a little too tight. And the defense was objecting a lot more than the prosecution objected during. I don't really think the prosecution objected at all during the direct, which, there was a lot of opportunities, just basically pleading and stuff like that. Yeah, but I've been talking for a while, so
no, it's fine. Yeah, that's cool, because we kind of needed the breakdown to set the stage. So thanks for kind of going over that. Like I said, I got to watch like half of the actual testimony, and I got to see snippets of the cross. Basically, is where and then plus the other stuff that you filled me in on. So I was trying to play catch up. I had to work today. I didn't have a lot of time to prepare before this, but it seemed just so interesting to watch because it is unusual, like you said, for a defendant in a murder trial to take the stand, and waive that Fifth Amendment, protection. But yeah, I guess as soon as I didn't think he was gonna do it, but then as soon as he did it, it was sort of my intuition, if I'm developing like a Haley gut about how this is gonna go, is that having done that, he's now gonna walk, because it's going to, or at least that's the gambit. I could see it playing out that he walks, and per the joke that got me, Zuckerberg, that he's going to take this now and be able to use it, for financial gain if he gets out of this, basically. And that's where all this is going. And it's going to the media circus very deliberately, partially as a defense strategy, but also, he's feeding the beast. For his own gain, yes, but also it just feeds the beast. It feeds polemics. It feeds, the divisiveness that's gonna shake out either, because everyone's pretty much already, and I'll admit I have too, has already made up their minds about whether or not he's guilty, right? I mean, we've all kind of got our own, with the exception of you, Haley, unprofessional opinions as to whether or not he should be found guilty for one or several accounts of either manslaughter or homicide, but either way. Watching this and watching my friends on the right and watching my friends on the left and the meme war that has already started around this, just off the testimony just today, going, isn't this just awful? Because part of the testimony, the kid's crying, right? And it was my instinct to be like, oh, look at the alligator tears on this kid. He looks like he's fake crying. I'll also have to say professionally, I've been around, and I mean this seriously, professionally, been around a lot of young people crying and being hysterical, and I'm a little bit numb to it, and so that may bias my reaction. Also, the fact that I do think he's pretty much guilty because he was there where he shouldn't have been, armed when he shouldn't have been armed, and no clear or direct threat to his life from what I've seen anyway. That especially in the first shooting, like you said, Haley, that he wasn't really really shouldn't have been there, and that I mean to say that he was really responsible for that as a homicide, and to see the crying and all that stuff, and I'm like, this is my initial reaction is like, this is bullshit, but it's like, is he also maybe a really scared kid who's only 18 and doesn't know shit about shit in the world and like is in way over his head and just trying to be brave and all this other shit? Like, I don't know, and I'm trying to be, circumspect with myself, but like, nobody wants to hear that out loud, really. Everyone, wants to be confident and have their minds made up about stuff. So I'm left being torn about how I feel about it, but I do think he's guilty. So go ahead, Haji.
So being torn about it and being
lost your audio immediately, sir. Hopefully we get Haji back. Warren, do you have thoughts here regarding this?
I do. Do you mind if I share my screen?
Yeah, please do. And Haji, we will come back to you. I'm sorry, we just lost your audio.
Am I there? Am I back? Joy of driving in the country.
Oh, yeah.
No.
We will come right back to you. I've got you now. I think okay. Warren's picked up something here. He likes to map this stuff out, which I find super fascinating. Everybody else might hate it, but
I'm a technical project manager at Texas Health Resources here in Dallas-Fort Worth area, and I do something called dialogue mapping, where I listen to conversation and I'm kind of thinking about these in real time, these things: structure, flow, relationship, grain, tension, quality, and frame. So as I was listening to the conversation, this is kind of where my mind went. The first is commission/omission context. So in other words, are we in, relatively speaking, peacetime or wartime? And I mean it more in the macro sense, not in terms of, countries going to war against each other, but in terms of was it just normal, peacetime, or was there conflict in it? I think it definitely was a metaphorical, more of a wartime context. And when you're in a wartime context, instead of the ends and means being justified, you have this odd thing where it can be right to do great evil for a greater good. Consider the question 20 years before I was born in 65. This was if we were an advisor at Truman's Round Table in 1945, we would have asked the question, is it right to burn the flesh off of women and children in Hiroshima so American sons don't have to die on the beaches of Tokyo? That's a tough one, and I think people could argue that, make a case either way. But when you're in a wartime context, things get real messy. So here are some questions, and to be honest, I try to promote epistemic humility, and there's a lot about this case I don't know. So one question I have is, to what extent were there protesters there, and to what extent were there rioters? What was the mix? Sometimes a protester could momentarily turn into a rioter, then back to a protester. Sometimes a protester might have the appearance of evil of a rioter, but they're not. And then I think, David, I think you've talked about this before in a previous podcast, open carry versus concealed carry. I think that's another thread.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we were talking about that on the last one. Not to interrupt you.
Yeah.
About the sort of the what do you call it? The chilling effect on free speech participation in public protest or demonstration because of the open carrying, or the perception that someone is carrying, whether it's open or concealed. But anyway, back to your thing. Sorry.
And here's some nuance that probably isn't appropriate to bring up in polite company, but I'll do it anyway. White versus black. I need to learn how to spell privilege correctly. One of those words.
It always gets me.
Long vowel. Yeah. So just so you know where I'm coming from, a short version. When George Floyd was murdered, one of my passions, almost like a tsunami wave coming in, I wanted to promote the awareness that was happening, particularly in the white community, so that all that didn't wash back out to sea as normally happens. So I started something called Grace About Race to deep dive on it. And then it became obvious over time that the real issue is more about grace about wisdom, and the notion of wicked problems that we deal with. So, and I think the meta-wicked problem is sense-making in the epistemic commons, governance, and politics. How do we have civil dialogue? How do we promote intricative complexity? How can we bypass the limbic hijack games? That's what Grace About Wisdom is about. I host every 2 weeks conversation on that, and I tell you, when you're not doing the limbic hijack game, it's hard to draw a crowd. But I'm very grateful that.
We had talked about that too. Yeah, that it's. This is less popular than engaging in just like the worst kind of hot takes, like the kind of hot takes that got me banned from Facebook for a week. But yes, please continue.
So my passion is, this is kind of the space I'm most drawn to, is kind of the ring to control all rings. In other words, how can we do? I'm a big fan of Daniel Schmachenberger and his Consilience project, and I know there are others, including what we're trying to do here, to move the ball forward. But then we have these wicked problems about belief, education, environment and climate change, exponential technology growth, globalization, healthcare, policing and jurisprudence, race, diversity, equity, inclusion, poverty and economics, and probably add abortion. That's one in the news as well, to that list.
Yeah, speaking of Texas.
My point is, if we as a society can't learn to be deliberative and dialectic and hold values in tension, if we can't have that civil conversation, how the insert expletive are we going to deal with these wicked problems? And the answer, sadly, now is not very well.
We don't. I don't honestly think we're intended to. Is sort of where I'm going with both all of those issues, and then the polemics du jour with regards to say the Rittenhouse trial or whatever the next thing everybody wants to fight about in the next news cycle is, right? It's kind of what it all comes back to, is I don't think we are intended to have good dialogue about this. We're not intended to come up with solutions about this. We're intended to fight about them and never solve them, because it's social media. The social media environment is like a reality show that never has a finale, right? That that's what politics and that's what society has become because of the way content is curated and the way in the way this kind of divisiveness is monetized, right? There's all the incentive to keep the reality show going. There's no incentive to bring it to a finale whatsoever.
Well said. So I will get back on Rittenhouse in just a second, but I
Sure.
mentioned the notion of white versus black privilege. So one of my passions is trying to educate white people about the history of white supremacy. So I created this slide in an effort to communicate that. So there's the success equals hard work plus opportunity equation. And opportunity is family, neighborhood, education, mentoring, networking, transition support, etc. Then there's, these are kind of tailwinds that don't guarantee success, but tend to make us more successful. If you're born in the first world, if you have middle class privilege, I'm a middle class dude. Aspiring for more, that's a whole nother story. Had some interesting opportunities with a startup in space technology. Wealthy class privilege, that really helps you out. Think of Bill Gates' daughter that just got married at her multi-million-dollar equestrian farm. Good for her. But
I guess. Yeah.
So think of the notion of white supremacy and white privilege is kind of and privilege has a notion of a positive and a negative. It can be getting extra stuff, or it can be exemption from getting the bad stuff. So in white supremacy era 1.0, the antebellum era, white privilege, aka black injustice, was not being a slave, not having labor stolen, being tortured, being raped, having children stolen. And then white supremacy 2.0, the Jim Crow era of moral atrocity, white privilege was not getting lynched, not getting redlined, not being called the N-word, not being denied service, not riding the back of the bus. And then I was born right at the end of this period. So I was born in 65 when Black lives still needed the Green Book to not get lynched and get service while traveling. The Green Book was published in 1967. So I can measure this shit, within the confines of my lifetime. This wasn't hundreds of years ago. It was, but it was more recent than that. So think of here the white hand of systemic racism pushed the iceberg down completely, the success iceberg. No matter how hard a slave worked, their opportunity was eclipsed by systemic racism. And here in the Jim Crow era, the hand was let up a bit, but it was still significant. And then now we're in this post-civil rights era where we have white privilege or black injustice is not experiencing past systemic effects of racism. So I tend to moderate my profanity when I'm being recorded. I have, I'm certainly no celebrity.
Well, you're on my show, not your show, so you can let it rip. You can let it rip, man.
I do have a lot of Republican evangelical friends and I don't want to distract them with my language. I'm fine if you guys want to drop F-bombs or whatever, and I may do it on occasion, but that's a whole nother conversation.
For sure.
But so I'll say it in a more PG way. So America in the past was racist as rhymes with truck, and that truck ran over people of color for generations. And just like asbestos or lead paint, you can stop putting it in houses and painting houses with it, but it's going to cause intergenerational damage, and you've really got to hunt for it to remove it.
Yeah.
So I feel like we've got
analogy.
This. Man, now I'm just going all over the map with CRT. I'll stop. But
I know, because the whole CRT thing. Yeah, it's very true, and and we've gone over this stuff before. Haley and Haji and anybody else who doesn't know that we've done several working sessions over weekends where we've kind of built on. He does all the design, of course, but we have these conversations and he maps these things out. He's been building on this for quite a while, but I think pursuant to this conversation, if we can try to bring it back around to what's going, your more specific take on how this relates to how we're looking at the Rittenhouse situation and the trial, if you will.
So my name, when I finally looked it up in my formative years, Warren, I thought it meant warrior or something cool like that, but it actually means keeper of rabbits or rabbit hole, and I do tend to go down the rabbit hole.
There you go. It's all right.
Prophetic. So back to white privilege. I just wanted to show that I do acknowledge the notion of white privilege. I acknowledge it's the norm, and I acknowledge it's been pretty much whitewashed by the lost cause pathology. That's one of my passions, is to pull the shorts down on that.
Good.
And then I think the Capitol riot insurrection is an example of the white crowd being given the benefit of the doubt. But we have, in some areas, I think we have reverse dynamics. I am neither left nor right, or probably I should say both left and right, as a cross-tribal bridge building, thick narrative, full messy story, divergent movie metaphor. So I am just as critical of the Portland riots, the freaking extreme left letting people, adult children, anarchists have their temper tantrums in co-opting Black Lives riots in Portland. And I'm also that insert expletive orange. Oh man, I could just open up. I detest Donald Trump to my core. That he incited that riot, and the Republicans are trying to cover that up. So one question I have is, in the context of the Rittenhouse riot there that was going on, or protest, was there Black privilege going on, in the sense that, oh, you're operating under Black Lives Matter protest, there's a Black man killed, and given all the crap that's happened, in the past, we're going to give you some slack to just be pissed and burn that store down. So we, the police, we're going to stand back and let it happen. Well, if that shit's happening, and it was happening and probably is happening in Portland, and if I was a business owner, I tell you, I would be arming up and protecting my family and my property to the extent that the police.
That is an interesting point, because that was actually quite relevant during the trial, as to whether or not you can use deadly force to protect. Now, and actually, Haley, this is a great question for you, because when that came up during the cross-examination, and I'm sorry, and I will pivot back to you, Warren. During the cross-examination, Rittenhouse was asked by the prosecutor whether or not it is legal to use deadly force to protect property. And I don't know if that's whether or not property period, or property in the state, or commercial property, or where exactly is the line with all of that. Haley,
you can't. Yeah. I mean, outside of like castle doctrine to being in your own house, you can't use deadly force to protect property. And I mean, the castle doctrine is only really, that's like only in a few states. Texas is one of them, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
I think Florida is one of them. The crazy states,
Yeah, I'm sure Tennessee has it.
Of note in the
batshit crazy around here
is that there's like a gas station or a car dealership or something that was burned down, and there's two other ones, and one of them was the one that Rittenhouse was helping people protect, and he texted the owner of that gas station, which he somehow met earlier that day, saying, let me know if you need me to come protect your property. I'm willing to come armed. And the owner never asked him to do that, didn't, request it. So, to get to kind of what Warren was saying, if this was oh yes, they're mad, so we're going to give them a little bit of latitude whenever it comes to their reaction. They're allowed to be mad, but I would start arming up to protect my business, while this one particular business owner had people saying, I'm coming here and I'm armed, and he was like, I didn't ask you to do that. So
yeah. That's and even if he did ask him to do it, it wouldn't really help the case, would it? Because you still can't use deadly force to protect property.
Yeah, there's the context that came up on the case. You can't really expect people to understand what a law is whenever, this witness isn't a lawyer. He is the defendant on the stand, and I would say that most people aren't lawyers, and aren't familiar with the specific, statutes in play in a given criminal proceeding. And so whenever they go on the stand, it's kind of a rude line of question to be like, so did you know that you were doing this unlawfully? You can say that you don't know what the law is. So that was why the prosecution got pushed back on that line of question.
Yeah, because he was answering in the affirmative that he knew that it was not, permissible to use deadly force, right?
Yeah.
Which he probably should not have answered that way if you were.
I mean, it came down to more of whether or not it was lawful for him to own a whether or not he thought it was unlawful for him to have a hand pistol. There was like some like what exactly he knew like was lawful or not. That was the big fight, and the deadly force was kind of caught up in that. So
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously, from a prosecutor's standpoint, it would make sense if you can get him to acknowledge that he should not have been trying to protect property with a gun, and he brought a gun to protect property. He was already doing something he knew he shouldn't have been. So, like, it kind of
yeah.
like just amps up the culpability on his part. So, but
Which,
yeah.
I kind of thought was like a little bit unfair because the prosecution was like, I'm trying to get like central to this case is Rittenhouse's intent.
Yeah.
And what his and whether or not like his mind, like whether or not he was acting as a reasonable person would act under those circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
And so, would a reasonable person think like I need to bring an AR-15 to guard a
Gas station or whatever.
gas station
Yeah.
or whatever?
Yeah. It's yeah, another really interesting point that I heard in Cross.
But he wasn't allowed to keep going on that line of questioning.
Yeah, he got
so I kinda
shut
thought
down.
That was unfair.
Yeah. The other question that he brought up, and then I want to go to Haji and then back to Warren, because I know Haji hasn't really got a chance to talk. Haji, is your mic working better now?
Yeah.
Okay,
I'm in
cool.
town.
Cool. I don't know what that is, but
Oh, the radar detector.
oh, are you watching for the police? So the other thing I wanted to bring up is that he was talking about. I think it was the second person that Rittenhouse shot, and the name escapes me. Of the
It also begins with an R, and that's why it's confusing. It's like
Yes.
Rosen something.
yeah, it was like
Rosenbaum.
Bomb. There you
That's
go.
it.
He was talking about the guy who had a gun himself. He had a pistol, and there was this question of, well, who was really the bigger threat? The person who just shot somebody and had their gun pointed at another person, or the other person who had a gun and had not shot anybody and was not pointing the gun at him, or at least not yet. And apparently the exchange happened.
Person who
The
was
second,
shot didn't have a gun.
so it's the third
Yeah,
person
the
then.
first two people didn't have a gun.
So
Person.
I'm talking about the third person then. My mistake. So, but the question of who is the bigger threat? I mean, if you're either of those people in that situation, the other person would be the threat, right? If you're looking out for yourself. So the whole line of questioning was weird, but like I could see where the prosecution was going with it, but at the same time, I didn't want to feel like two people are running around basically on opposite sides of whatever issue. They're both armed. You're both going to look at the other person like they are a mortal threat, especially if there's already, been violence, that night, especially deadly violence using a firearm. So, I mean,
and here's something I think it gets a little muddy here because there's the intent of the defendant, actual intent versus perceived intent by the assailant, and then from the assailant's, I guess, so the defendant is looking at the assailant thinking, okay, they can only see certain things and make perceptions. So was there a delta between the perception of intent versus the actual intent? And then you also have the assailant looking at the defendant, and you have the same degrees of freedom. And then do they have a weapon? And then here's a case like in the Michael Brown shooting, you have to look at the size differential of the people. And here's a case where, the cop that killed Michael Brown was, he was exonerated, and they found systemic racism in that area, in that police department. So it was both and. But Michael Brown tried to take that officer's gun, and he was a huge dude compared to the size of the officer. Darren, someone, I think, I remember correctly. So you have to look at the relative size. I think.
So I think you're kind of getting in the weeds. I'm not trying to cut you off or anything, but in these situations, it's the standard is a reasonable person. So would a reasonable person have felt like they were threatened? But they are put in the shoes of the defendant. So in the cop who killed Michael Brown, was it, if you are that person standing in those shoes and you are the same build as that police officer and have the, the same whatever weapons he had on him, and this person who is this size is coming at you, like that, all the totality of the circumstances are still going to come into play, but it's whether or not it's reasonable for the person, the defendant at that time, what was his action, would a reasonable person have done the same thing? And so, that's like the intent of, you analyze the intent of the defendant and think, okay, and then the next question after that is, okay, in these circumstances, putting a reasonable person in the shoes of the defendant, would they have done something different? And what would it be?
So I think it's the relative physical size and strength of defendant versus assailant, and I think it's also the number of defendants versus the number of assailants. Two gangs, if one it's a 1-to-1 ratio or a 10-to-5 ratio, all that is the notion
consider
of
the
reasonable,
totality of the circumstances of whatever's
yeah,
happening in the incident.
exactly. And I think the notion of reasonable is contextual. And here's where I'm handicapped because I'm not privy to those facts.
For sure. So,
All right, so
yeah, yes, Haji, I was just about to go to you. Sorry about that.
so
Yeah.
long time going. So I do think he's 100% going to get off from the last one with Rosenbaum, because someone has a gun, you have a gun. Of course, you have the ability to say that person, you were feared by the person who had a gun. And the still shot that shows the gun facing forward doesn't necessarily say it's at him, but it's close enough that one to me is a wash, and I'm pretty much sure that one's going to go away. The skateboard and the plastic bag, which were the other items that he was being threatened by, are a little bit more on the how you see it spectrum. But there's a good chance he's just going to be the new Zimmerman. That being said, the reason why is, just like Zimmerman, they completely ignored everything up to the moment where he felt threatened.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a feeling they're going to look at it the same way. They're going to ignore everything that happened up to the point of when he was threatened. And once he felt threatened, therefore he's okay to shoot. The mentally unstable person who got shot first, supposedly there was a gun sound as he threw the bag at him. So that's where his right to shoot back is. The second one, when he was getting attacked by a skateboard, they're going to say, well, he hit me with the skateboard, but this is what I had in my hand to defend myself. So I have a bad feeling that it's going to be the same way.
That's a great
regardless of whether or not he was supposed to have the gun that was there, regardless of the reason why he was there, regardless that he came to help something that somebody didn't ask him to help with, regardless of the fact that he was trained by a militia but not with the militia. All of those side factors that make it his fault for being in that situation, they're going to ignore. They're just going to look at that last minute right before. That, given the way things have been expressed during the trial, I find it very easy that anybody who thought that they were going to be objective and pretended that they didn't see any of the news coverage, that's the way I'm going to see they're going to look at it. And at the large, and this may be a thing, me not understanding that part of the law, but it always seems that the only part required in statements where they use a self-defense castle doctrine in this kind of scenario is what happens right before he fires the bullet, not what led the person to be there in the first place.
Well, I mean, you have to consider the totality of the circumstances. And so, to the extent that the events leading up to, the moment that someone is killed, go to a person's, mental state at that moment, those are relevant. But, his decision to bring a gun, to like this AR-15 to protect a gas station, whenever the jury is considering the totality of the circumstances that go to his state of mind at that point in time, they might not put much weight on that. And that's for the jury to decide. One of the things I just wanted to note, like, I don't think he's going to get convicted of murder. I don't know how it works in Wisconsin, but I did notice a shift during the course of cross-examination to where kind of seemed like they weren't going for murder anymore, that they were going for recklessness, negligent homicide, or to manslaughter to the extent that they could, just because murder's hard to get. It's hard to convict someone of murder at trial. So I know that you can do it kind of that way in Texas. And I'm not going to get into really specific things, just kind of general broad strokes, but seems like the prosecution is trying to nail down some of the lesser killing offenses.
Yeah, that's the only perception I got of it too. And I saw spotty coverage because I was obviously working. And then going back to Warren's statement about the whole black privilege to destroy stuff argument with the riot.
I was waiting on that.
Are you not also taking into account the white privilege of cops only protecting where the white neighborhoods are?
It's a great point.
Especially because you got to go to like the Watts riots, Chicago riots, the riots in LA after Rodney King, and all of those situations, the police manned up just outside of the black neighborhoods.
You make an excellent point. I don't know. This is Wisconsin. It's if it was Texas, I'd be like, oh heck yes, that's white privilege. Portland, I'd be, that may be black privilege. Wisconsin, I don't know.
Yeah, and even with Portland, I would think Seattle's a better example of their argument you're trying to use instead of Portland.
Okay.
Because Portland, they made a lot more out of the damage than there actually was damage, as opposed to Seattle, where they let them basically take over 10 blocks. And that was a perfect example of an anarchist takeover of the BLM protest.
Are you talking about where they set up like that, like no police zone or whatever in Seattle?
Yeah.
Is that the one?
Yeah.
And then like a couple of people died and they're like, okay, we have to stop now. Like, is that?
Well, they didn't say we have to stop. The police said, no, that's enough. And they finally
Gotcha.
kind of pushed in. They didn't dissolve. They were dissolved.
Right. Okay. Well, these are interesting granular details that I wasn't aware of at the time. I just knew people died and then it ended up stopping. I didn't know really exactly how or why, but that's what I came to understand too about Portland. Just saying the word Portland, it carries so many connotations that are political now. And I think that's, fair to criticize that maybe we're pettifogging that, because from what I understand, I have a friend who lives not far from Portland, but that described the actual areas of vandalism, violence, what have you, in Portland is only being like a couple, which not that it's great, but like only being a couple of blocks versus like when you say Portland riots, it makes it sound like the riot has consumed the entire city of Portland. Right, and that's not really the case, but it carries that connotation. It's just like in a similar way, and Warren, this is not a criticism of you or anything, but just me thinking out loud about it.
Criticize away, man.
Yeah. So it's when you say that there were BLM protests after George Floyd, and then somebody wants to characterize it all as the BLM riots after George Floyd because there were isolated pockets of violence, vandalism, what have you, actual rioting taking place, wherever that was, but it wasn't normative. It wasn't the preponderance of what was going on during that period of time. But now we call them the BLM riots, right? Depending on your political perspective, and I think we do have a way of pettifogging those tiny details or incidences and try to paint it as, this is just normative of the entire thing. And back to Hadi's point, what happened in Seattle was much more pervasive, but that doesn't get talked about nearly as much, and that's not to blame anybody. It's just, it's a point where we all should just think about it a little bit more. But yeah.
Now,
No.
Part of the reason Portland became so inflamed
is man, we lost your audio. I was there. I was like pregnant with anticipation. Sorry. I was like, what's he gonna say next? I had to do.
Well, I'll take this moment to say my goodbye because I got to hop off now. But
Yeah.
I do think that he's going to be acquitted on the murder charges. So I think it's probably time for like people to start wrapping their heads around that most likely inevitability.
Yeah.
So is that a word? Inevitability?
Yes. Yeah. Yes, it is. Inevitability.
All right. So did you guys hear my Portland statement?
All right, we'll see it. Thank you much for your insight. Care, appreciate you.
Later,
Take care of yourself.
Bye, Haley. Miss you.
Bye.
See you next time.
Later.
Boop. Okay, and then there were two other than me. But Haji,
right, so
before
did you hear my Portland statement?
You said you were kind of like no, because, and then you completely cut out.
Okay, so Portland is in itself a southern state that just happens to be on the West Coast. Oregon is.
Okay.
And the reason why that is completely true is Portland's original constitution, it was a whites-only state.
It was a whites-only state? Is that what you said?
Oregon was a whites-only state in its original constitution. So it is Atlanta.
Haji, I'm having a lot of trouble with your audio, man.
I appreciate the history.
You got me better?
A little better. We got to get you on a hard line, man.
Well, that and the fact that I flew late. People need to stop getting sick at the end of my day.
You know, I agree with that. Especially because we want to start earlier, too, for Haley's benefit. Apparently, she goes to bed at 8 o'clock now. But sorry, go ahead.
So Oregon was a whites-only state, so it's more accurate to look at Portland as if it is Atlanta.
Okay. It's
a liberal city inside of a ridiculously conservative state.
See, I would never have thought that. I still don't spend any time paying attention to Oregon, really, but that's good to know.
Why there's like a third of Oregon that is trying to be connected to Idaho instead of being Oregon.
That's an interesting dynamic. Thank you for explaining that, Haji.
Yeah, because they would rather they think that the city with the people don't represent them because literally their own words, they're not like us.
Yeah, and I can appreciate that in the sense that once you get outside of any major city, you kind of feel like you're in the South. I grew up in Northern Virginia, Washington, D.C. area. You go 50 miles out of there, you're in the middle of Alabama, which is the same kind of, culturally and environmentally as the middle of Alabama, which, Virginia is itself a southern state. But I guess I never really thought about that the same way as I would the Pacific Northwest. I have seen it in Pennsylvania that it's not it's more like Appalachian and stuff like that, but kind of culturally it's still very red. All right, I shouldn't say culturally, I should say politically, but maybe that's the same thing now. But it's still very red,
Which by the way, the Appalachians used to be ridiculously blue because of FDR.
Yeah.
They've been turned red by the lack of the Democrats to still continue being like FDR.
Yeah, well, we can do a whole separate show on the failures of the Democratic Party. That's fine. We can do that. We actually touched on that a little bit last time, which I think you and I are very much in sort of agreement on the shortcomings of the Biden administration. But anyway, to get back to this,
what you were starting, Warren.
Yeah, and then I do want to move on to. And I don't know, Haji, if you caught this or not. I was talking about the sort of the next iteration of what social media is doing to society. And I'll just kind of put it out there more as a think piece than anything else that we're not going to come up with solutions tonight, but it was an interesting thing that I wanted to mention. But back to Warren, let's wrap up Rittenhouse and then move on.
So is this, do you mind, David, if I just do a quick summary to see if we
Please
come
do.
to consensus?
Sure.
Okay, so again, to what extent was this somebody in peacetime acting like a warrior inappropriate, or somebody in a micro wartime context doing extreme things in self-defense? So again, I think context is king here, and considerations, gun laws, open carry versus concealed, minor versus adult, purchasing a gun versus using a gun, white versus black privilege dynamics. Black privilege is the exception, but it can happen. Was that relevant there? I don't know. Lethal force. From the defendant's perspective, how did they see the assailant in terms of perceptual versus actual intent? Was there a delta, and vice versa? Reasonable person standard, matters of fact. What's the context? What happened leading up to the violence? The mental state, the preparation versus premeditation, relative size and strength of defendant and assailant, relative number of defendants to assailants. And then, so these are matters of fact, in fact, matters of fact, value, weighting, and meaning. That's where different people can perceive this differently. So hopefully, again, I try to keep my nose clean because I don't have confidence. No, given we're semi-evolved primates that are ridiculously subject to confirmation bias.
Sure.
I don't have a lot of confidence in our court system.
Yeah,
that
that's.
The notion of reasonable
I tried to
apply properly.
I tried to talk a little bit with Haley about that earlier today, and Haley's very direct and make sure she lets me know that I'm not a lawyer. The way I understand it is that this is mostly borne out in case law, how things were ruled, beforehand in similar circumstances. What was considered to be a reasonable action is going to be determined legally by cases that came before it of, this person had a gun, that person had a gun, who kind of had theirs raised first. Was it pointed at them? Were they threatened? Did they feel like their life was in danger? What did we already determine a reasonable person would do in that situation? And that precedent would essentially, and it's not prescriptive, but it's predictive of how they would rule in a similar situation, moving forward. That's the whole stare decisis thing. But yeah, again, being a dilettante and definitely not a lawyer, that was sort of my understanding of it. What is the reasonable person standard? Because that's very squishy, right? That's very gray just talking about it. But in terms of how it's legally understood, that it's a lot more to do what's already been decided, rather than just arguing it like it's a brand new thing, Unless you're an originalist, but I'm not going down there. I won't do it. I won't do it.
So the reasonable person standard, the biggest problem is the fact of when they start that moment. Where do they start that it's his reasonable decision? Going off the wartime, peacetime decision. Yes, I could agree that in that moment, as a war vet anyway, but I can agree that in that moment, from the chase in the parking lot till he's walking past the cops with his hands up, yes, that was a wartime decision type moment. Because of the speed and the pace and everything that's happening, I get that. But in fact, his original decision was a peacetime decision. It's very similar to someone in Lebanon wanting to go fight Lebanon's not a great example, but someone in Morocco wanting to go and join ISIL so that they could fight in the jihad. They left from a peacetime scenario, put themselves into a war scenario, and then made war decisions. But had they never gone, they would not have, had they not made the decision in the peacetime selection to go into the war selection, they would have never been in that scenario.
Yeah, this is kind of like an airtime law, the doctrine of last chance. In other words, a ship captain, even if he's in the right, if he could have avoided the collision, he's still responsible.
Yeah.
Yeah. That is exactly how maritime. Like prime example, the Titanic. The fact that they sailed north is why, regardless of the fact that he couldn't get around the ice.
The iceberg. I think we lost Haji's audio again. But yeah, I think to put a bow on this, I think Rittenhouse is going to be the next George Zimmerman. That he is going to be a darling of conservatives generally and the alt-right and whatever iteration that they're currently existing in anymore. That he's, and I've already seen it. I've already seen the memes that he's. I'm looking at one right now. The hashtag Rittenhouse, patron saint of yeet in the street, and there's literally a picture of him holding a gun and juxtapose. You won't be able to see this very well, but and then there's a picture of Christ on the cross next to him.
Oh my gosh.
That's, I mean, I'm not making it up. Like that's
Wow.
Somebody did that,
wow.
and people are laughing at it. Like that's because and it really comes down, and the reason why it's Zimmerman 2.0 is because it's not about whether or not he should have been there, whether or not he should have done it. It's because whether or not they like him for killing people they don't like is what I think it really comes down to. And that's it. And, and they could just as easily make the same accusation of the people who think he's guilty. And that's sort of the consternation that I was engaged in kind of at the top of the show, being like, I do think he's guilty. But am I being dismissive of him, because of that? Do I want to see him punished just because, or could I be accused of just wanting to see him punished because he hurt people that I might identify with more than I want to identify with somebody like him, the guy who's like, the young police explorers and fire explorers, and he had his guns and his body armor and showing off his weapons on, it was Instagram or whatever it was. Like, this is the kind of person I identify with in any way, really. And the fact that he's not my kind, more than the people who became his victims, is that the only real reason? And that's, I think it's a fair accusation, and it makes me have to wonder. I mean, I am trying to look at the facts and engage in content analysis here to determine whether or not he is really criminally liable for his actions. And I think I've still come to the same decision, but don't we all? And that's sort of, I guess, my final thought on it. And because we're already at 1 hour, I did want to move on at this point and talk about something that's even worse than this.
Hey, David?
Yes.
Just to negotiate time, I need to drop off in a half hour. I love this next topic you have teed up.
Yeah.
This could be a whole episode itself. I have a story that's relevant to this that I'd love to share, but if you want to move on, you're the host.
You know what? I think, because it could be a topic all on its own. It could be, an episode that you and I just do. How about this? I will tease it, and I will tease another thing that I'm working on, and then we can talk, again, we can move into your other story and then just kind of end it here, because we're already kind of at the hour mark. I try not to let these things run on too long, and we're all kind of limited on time. But I will say I read to just explain to people, if anyone's still paying attention to this, I read a Big Think article on it, and I forget the name of the author. It escapes me. But our friend Chris Martin, who sometimes participates on the show, posted it on his wall, and I couldn't really comment too much on it because I got banned today. But basically, if you think about how bad social media is now, the fact that the content that we get to see is curated for us, and not just Facebook, but even our Google search algorithms and everything else, that our content is moderated for us to give us more of the things that we want to keep us engaged, and it's putting us in an environment of incredible selection effect or selection bias, and we see the world just very, very differently as a result of it. Than people who have a different ideology than ourselves. We no longer really share the same perception of reality. and what makes this so much more dangerous, and I'm just teasing it and we're going to move on, is the next iteration of this is augmented reality. It's already come out in the form of games, basically. Oh, I lost Warren. Well, that sucks. Haji, you still with me?
Still with you.
Yeah, that I don't think that was intentional on his part. But because this is a topic he and I talked about offline beforehand, and he was interested in. But the idea, think about how bad things are now. If you just tell somebody if you're a liberal or conservative on Facebook, imagine how it would be walking down the street and you have some fancy high tech glasses or a little contact or something like that. That as you look around and see people, it puts a bubble over their head, tells you Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, Christian, Muslim, atheist, racist, leftist, communist, alt-right, whatever it is. Imagine you had access to that kind of information that you could paint on people whether or not they wanted to see or whether or not they want to be seen in themselves. Like, imagine how bad are things now just in be able to dialogue with anybody really that you're not in lockstep with. Imagine how much worse it will be in an environment like that, and like what to do about it was the idea of the topic. Which again, I am teasing that. Go ahead. Go ahead. Do you want to say something now, or do you want to wait?
I'll say something now, and then I'll say something later.
Okay, say something now. And then, there he is.
How would they put that together? Would that be based off of your other posts that you do? Which
potentially, yeah. I mean, if Facebook knows
aggregating whatever public image that you have, so I could see that. I, as you notice from my page, would be the person that talks to everybody that's different than me.
Yeah.
Mainly just because I'm like, all right, what are you thinking about? What are you thinking about?
Yeah.
At the same time, the thing you're saying to warn yourself about is probably the same thing that 20% of white people already do.
Yeah, I think it's more than 20% of white people. They want to find their own tribes, right? We have other ways of doing it.
Well, no.
Imagine never being able to turn it off. I guess is sort of the real danger of it.
I mean, as far as like 20%, I would say 20% of white people literally avoid those that are different.
I think it's more than that. Like I said, I agree with you, but I think it's more than that. And I don't think, and not to go mud both sides, but like, I think there is an element that I have seen on each side of the political spectrum of people who will absolutely just not engage whatsoever. And there's varied reasons for it. And some I'm more sympathetic to and some I'm not, if we're talking about, your dignity as a human being as a topic for academic debate is something that you don't really think is on the table because it's about your dignity as a human being. Like, I'm not going to talk to people who look at me as subhuman because because I'm an atheist or whatever. I'm thinking about something about me, but like, say, black or Muslim or Jewish or whatever the fuck else. Like, if you think that or trans, especially because that's like very du jour right now, that's not real, and we're just gonna treat those people like they're subhuman, they're stupid, they're mentally damaged, whatever. Like, that's not really just up for casual conversation. We're not going to sit down and sip fancy whiskey and have about whether or not I'm a person. Basically, like, there are people who cut people like that off. I kind of can sympathize, but like at the same time, we do create our own silos by doing that. So I don't. It's not that I have a solution. I'm just kind of turning the problem over in my head.
We completely do. I would say it would get heightened from what it already is.
Yeah.
And then liberals would have people snatching their purses instead of just black people seeing black people grabbing their purses.
Yeah.
They do the pull the kid away from the liberal.
Have you been to Tennessee?
I used to do a lot of cross countries in Nashville, but hey,
man, you ever come down, man? We need to hang out, seriously.
Oh, definitely. So the thing that I think is funny, since you brought up the other group of this time period, which is the trans now other group, that's the main other group. Somebody was talking to somebody and they're like, because this is just a new thing. It's never happened. And
Well, it's been around for, yeah, I know.
I pulled it up and showed somebody. I was like, so here's a trans person in the Ethiopian hieroglyphics. So just to give you an idea of how long that's been.
How long that's been in a gender identity in not in formal terms, but
They're
has
like-
been a thing.
They're like,
Yeah.
no, they're like, no, it's not. I'm like, the drawing has boobs and a penis.
You tell me.
Like,
You tell me. But
just
yeah.
out of curiosity, wouldn't that pretty much be it?
But anyway, so I want to do the that's sort of the brief tease. We will have a bigger conversation about that. Warren, sorry I lost you. Thank you for coming back in. But basically, just describe kind of what we talked about on the phone the other day. So, you know, and I didn't really prognosticate too much of anything, but like just kind of laid out to tease the future topic. Other future topic, again, something Warren, you and I talked about. RJ, who couldn't join us tonight, he is the admin and I think founder of two groups called Jordan B. Peterson, or just Jordan Peterson, is an idiot's vision of a smart person, and also Ben Shapiro is an idiot's vision of a smart person. I'm going to be doing an episode next week with him. Expect that soon, to explain why that is the case. And it is the teaser is not to say that those people themselves are idiots, but it is perhaps what an unintelligent person might regard to be the presentation of a highly informed intellectual, when really it's kind of anything but. And I'm gonna let him do that, because he created these two little groups that have gone viral and blown up into thousands of members and gets way more activity, and like I don't even pay attention to him. I'm not moderating both these groups, and it's like, this is just wild shit that's happening, and I don't know why. And it's to conversations that I've had with Warren in the past is like, I do try to build a bridge. I do want to talk to people across the aisle and understand how they're thinking, and talk to them like real human beings with, worthy of dignity and respect. And at the same time, sometimes I want to burn a bridge. And honestly, it's because of the forces that make those kinds of conversations so much more difficult than they have to be. It aggravates the absolute fuck out of me. When you see people like that, they make everything worse. And I'm sure there are probably examples that you can find on the left of people doing the same shit. But these are two that I'm very well aware of, and just cannot stand. But anyway, so those are my teasers for the night. Warren and Haji, if you guys had anything else to add, or if you guys want to have a back and forth between each other a little bit, please have at it. But I'm going to try and wrap up in about 10 minutes here.
Sounds great. Haji, I'd love to hear more of your story as a person of color in a white normative country. I'm, myself and David, we are experientially blind to, any remaining remnants of systemic racism.
I'm whiter than this wall behind me.
you are.
I just looked. I was like, "Shit, I'm paler than this wall that's behind me."
That's very true.
It's like an off-white. But anyway, yeah.
So, all right. Our true conversations between started off of a post that I put down of me running into a kid and being an adult and having a kid call me a nigger. While he had done nothing with his life and I had done what I had done with my life. So yes, it happens a lot more. I've talked about the things that the amount of times I've run into the cops and dealt with the cops, which is why I will never be without a radar detector. And how things go down and how things happen, and the fact that I stopped carrying a gun thanks to Fred, I can't honor him with his name. But the guy who got shot after telling the cop that he had a gun in the car.
Oh yeah, I know who you're talking about. I know the case.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about too.
Yeah.
I rewatched that video way too many times. It's terrible. Really, I can't remember his name, but I'm forever disturbed by it.
And then, to be honest, the worst case is Tamir Rice. So when you talk about the size difference and the size perspective, the fact of the matter is, as soon as a black person is about 11 or 12, they are called an adult. They are told that he's as big as an adult. He's just as big as an adult. And that's the reason why Tamir Rice is dead. Which, if you don't remember, was a little kid playing with a gun. Am I still on?
Yeah, we can hear you. We can hear you fine.
You
Sorry, I was
still,
looking. I'm
still that I was like, did it lock up?
Yeah, for a second I thought Warren did too. I was actually looking up, and this is for the edification of Warren and everybody else listening. I was looking up the episode that you and I did, and I'm just going to interject that and then let you get back to it. But season 4, episode 3 on racism and perspective with Haji Sharif, released February 21st. If you guys want to check that out, it was a wonderful conversation and gives a lot more kind of background history on Haji and a lot of his experiences, and why I value him as a friend and contributor on this show. But anyway, please continue.
But yeah, so like Tamir Rice, for everybody's edification, was a kid playing with a gun in the park. Just a normal, like 11 or 12-year-old kid playing with a gun in the park. People across the street said there's a man in the park threatening everyone with a gun. He was playing with a little toy gun. And the cops pulled up, and within 2 seconds, they pulled up, stepped outside, shot the kid.
Yep.
There's no conversation with the kid. There's no... on top of that, with people who are police, and they're like, well, they might have been threatened. I was like, then why did he pull all the way up to the kid? If you're threatened and you think the person's going to shoot you, you don't pull 5 feet away from the guy and then hop outside. You don't hop out. You don't keep the car facing straight. So the only thing that's stopping you is the door. You get all the way behind your car. If you're really doing that, I'm a trained peace officer. So it's one of those where I'm like, that is not a matter of him truly just feeling threatened. That's him going, they said there's a man in the park with a gun. He saw a 12-year-old kid with the toy gun. That must be the man. Jumped out, shot him. Whereas if that had been a 12-year-old kid, 12-year-old white kid, there's no way that spectrum would have gone the same way. And that is the problem when I tell people, like, all right, here's the main easiest way to think about race and the issues we have. And it's in that scenario, because not only did the person who was a bystander call a 12-year-old kid a man, there was people that walked by that like looked and saw the kid playing with the gun. He did the normal like 12-year-old pew 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 to 2 of the people that walked by. So they did the whole like, I'm dead when they walked by. And the person across the street goes, oh, I thought that's because he was threatening them. It's a
and that you know, a lot of that feeds into the perception that black people are older, bigger, more intimidating than, you know, white counterparts who are actually the same age and size as they are. And it's that distortion of perception. And it's one of the things that's so freaking hard to explain to people, because like I've seen, you know, abstracts of psychological studies where, you know, where they describe this phenomenon, but you're like, well, I've seen studies that show, and they're like, oh yeah, where's your citation? Can you show me? And I was like, no, it's a thing you have to subscribe to. My girlfriend is in school for psychology. I got to see it. I can't really show you. Yeah. And then they're like, oh, so you're full of shit, you know?
So the same as the black doll, white doll thing that they have done again, and it still goes the same way 40 years after they started it. The silliness in concept of everything being equal causes the problem of it not being.
Yeah.
You can't, and I'm very, and on my own little annoyance, I get really annoyed with people who love to say the statement of, if you don't know your history, you'll repeat your history, and then still are arguing against whether or not they should talk about slavery being bad.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the level of projection is very whiplash inducing. I think that's part of a meta conversation that we might have sometime to discuss, because, you know, and I'll bring up something that a lot of times when I have conversations with, and I'll just say it with conservatives, and they'll say, oh, well, you know, the left or the Democrats, they say they're the party of science, but, and then they say something that is completely inaccurate to scientific consensus. And it's like, I don't even know how to start to unpack this with you. And it's the same way with, you don't know your that in Columbia, Tennessee, where fortunately I don't live anymore, but very, very popular were like Confederate flag T-shirts that said, if this flag offends you, you don't know your history. And I'm like, the fuck? Like, I don't.
Look at
how
the
do you
source
start with that, right? Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
you're right. Look at if you did look at the history, you would understand that you've got this completely ass backwards. But how to start a conversation, not from a point of having taken offense at the wild ignorance and the accusations against your own, acumen or character or whatever it is, to have that conversation in the first place. It's like that's the real crux of what we're dealing with, and Warren, we talk about sense making and stuff like that. It's like you have to go beyond that. Like you have to go to people who have engaged in the worst kind of, method of ascertaining what is real and have come to very terrible conclusions. And not only do you have to be great at sense making, that you have to be so great at it that you can help them overcome all of the mistakes that they have made that are blatant mistakes. In some of the cases, it's not quite so blatant, but these are a couple of examples that are like just extraordinarily blatant errors in reasoning and in ascertaining knowledge. And it's like, how do you even start? That is the real crux of what I would like to see in terms of bridge building. Go ahead.
The mind of the South is controlled by the most powerful women of all time, and that would be the daughters
of the Confederacy, for sure.
I agree with that, and to even go deeper, I think it's egoic epistemology. Consider the question: how does a people celebrate noble sacrifice and valor for a vile cause? In contrast, Germany with the southern states of the U.S., the narrative to make it noble with a lost cause mythology, and I think that's what a lot of the CRT, huss and fuss on the right is about. It's about kind of white supremacy or lost cause mythology 2.0, promoting denialism to a great extent.
Oh, completely. And the wonderful passion of the fact that if I give you the same rights as me, I'm actually.
Yeah, that's you're cutting out a little bit, but yeah, it's something that atheists have been saying, for a long time. Is that when you're so used to privilege that equality feels like oppression, and that's
yes.
That is kind of a catchphrase or whatever, but like it holds true with a lot of things that people who are so used to being sort of the center of attention of politics, culture, all of that society is lifting you up as the ideal. And when now it's saying, well, actually some of that stuff that's put you where you are is pretty bad. And also there's all these other things out here that are really great too. Like you're not really the center of attention anymore. And feeling the loss of that feels, I think, to a lot of them as the same as saying you are now less than these other things. And I don't think that's necessarily the case. It's just a readjustment that feels like persecution, and that plays into a lot of narratives too.
Which is why a lot of people argue. Like I try to explain the best way to explain how CRT could actually help as opposed to the way it is to simply go explain Christopher Columbus discovering a land that people were at. How is he discovering it?
Well, they weren't doing anything with it, you see.
He's not the first person there. The only way it becomes important is if you only consider what Europeans have done.
Yeah.
To which I also go, well, that's still not right. Like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, the Vikings had been in America way before Christopher Columbus.
It wasn't even kind of reconfirmed recently. I think there was some new discovery of Leif Erikson or whoever the hell. We're not that they were found an uninhabited continent because there were already people here, as you said. But we're here before Columbus. But we like what our textbooks say. Because it's funny, a neat story about freedom.
Well, the Nordic explanation explains that they found another inhabited land. They say it's an inhabited land.
Yeah.
They don't say, oh, we just made the first people here. They said, no, it's founded by an inhabited land that lived more equally than we did. Which, to be honest, if you look at the Viking culture, they were actually really egalitarian kind of society.
In some ways, yeah, but like, it's not consistent. We'll just leave it at that.
Especially for the time period, though, they were.
Yeah, it meant we're losing you.
Unless you weren't a conquered slave, but they were.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, except for the slaves, they was pretty egalitarian. That's kind of what I was getting at. It's like there's some give and take here. Okay, like we can.
Well, and even in that perspective,
as much as we all like watching Vikings, like it's not,
Yeah. Well, there's another reason why.
Lots of human sacrifice in that show.
They're a perfect example of when everyone goes, oh, and I'm like, yeah, but there's a difference between that slavery and our slavery. Because those slaves could earn their freedom, which was the normal way of slavery up until that point.
Yeah,
you weren't expected to give your kids over and all the other stuff.
Right. Yeah.
You still weren't able to leave when you wanted to leave, but it was a totally different kind of scenario.
But let's not get too into the weeds. We should wrap up.
As long as you have the idea that history only happens from the Western civilization point, you will never truly understand the effects of that thought.
Yeah, no, I hear that.
It's just like if you think boys are all good at math and science and girls aren't, then girls aren't going to learn math and science right. Not because they can't, just because you're teaching intentionally that it's supposed to be the other way.
Yeah, I agree with that. Warren.
Yay, Daughters of Confederacy.
Yeah, they're
slewing the entire country for years and years and years to go.
Yeah, they're awful. I mean, you don't have to go far from here. I will give you a second, Warren. But even in Franklin, it's one of these Confederate mine that it's all. There's like a plaque to lost cause mythology, and you can't do anything about it because the Daughters of the Confederacy, and it's in the town like square of Franklin, Tennessee, and you can't do anything about it because they bought that little,
that little patch,
that little patch of land, and now it's theirs. It's no longer public property; it's their private property. You can't do anything with it, so it will just be there in perpetuity until someone decides to do something, extrajudicial to get rid of it. But anyway, so we don't have any solutions here tonight. We got a lot of problems we're talking about, but no solutions. Warren, final thoughts from you, sir.
Oh boy, Haji, I've got the goods on white people. So at some point, I'd love to show you some of my accumulated knowledge assets. I'm just surprised that more people on the left don't quote from, Ebenezer Warren's Southern Baptist pastor wrote in 1864, Nellie Norton, basically weaponizing the Bible to justify the moral atrocity of Southern chattel slavery. And the smoking gun in Texas is the actual secession document text that basically says, Black people are here for the pleasure and profit of white people, and this is cool, and is justified by God and the Bible and Christian nation. I mean, it's the frickin' smoking gun, and it's not in our history books. And one of my projects is to get with the curator of the Austin State History Museum and to get that posted. I'm playing a long game here. I want to educate young minds, so young white kids in their formative years, 20 years down the road, when they're driving through Weatherford, their response when they see that statue still up there celebrating owning Black people like farm animals, their response will be, WTF, why is there a Nazi statue in Times Square? If you don't have that historical context, you're going to be thinking, Daisy Duke in her short shorts and the sweet sound of a low-far muscle car firing up with General Lee, as I was socialized.
Old Bo and Luke Duke.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, no, I hear that. And I think that's a great sort of, mimetic type thought of like, imagine if Germany was, not Germany, but Germans were preserving statues of, not necessarily Hitler because it's too on the nose, but like Goering or, some of these other figures that were prominent in the Nazi party and in the regime, of being like, oh, well, they were such great, philanthropists, or, after the war, they did, this and this, and they were so kind, and they did this great humanitarian work. And I am talking directly to the people who really like Nathan Bedford Forrest, but like that's it's essentially the same thing of being like,
Thank you.
Well,
Yes,
after
it
they
is.
got caught with their pants down effectively and managed to survive the things that they did, or the consequences of it, then they went on to do things that were less horrible, and now we're supposed to love them. No, I'm not into it, and this has gone way the hell off of Rittenhouse and everything else, but like. That to say, and to bring it back to that, just sort of in finality, is like he's going to be the next Zimmerman. Just watch and see, and be disappointed with humanity, as I am frequently. And on that extremely,
he's gonna be bigger than Zimmerman because he's not as much of an asshole as Zimmerman.
Yeah, well, I don't know if he knew his I don't know if it was his Instagram or Twitter handle was like 4 doors more whores or something like that. It was like that came out in the cross examination of like
he's a 17-year-old kid. That's really not that
which
big of a deal.
it's not. It's which it's accurate. And I'm not saying I was less of a dumbass at his age because I probably was. I mean. No, I wasn't that much of a dumbass at his age. I would not have gone to, a protest / riot, whatever you want to call it, with an AR, trying to be a solution, to a problem. I would not have done that. But in terms of something like that, yeah, I might have been that dumb. But like, he paints himself as this very wholesome, innocent, caring about other people and wanting to be a great protector and all this other lovely stuff. And it's like, not really accurate, but anyway. So, but yeah, he's no Zimmerman. I mean, Zimmerman just leans into it, but give the kid 20 years, and that's the thing. That's the thing that disappoints me about him and about Sandman, the kid from the whole the fiasco with the Native Americans and the that whole thing of being like, man, those kids were shitty, but like they weren't the only bad actors, and they were kids. But like he's become the poster child of because he went around and sued all the big news channels, and he got some settlements out of it that were undisclosed amounts. But like he's now the poster child for how the left mistreats these poor MAGA kids or whatever the hell. And like instead of being like maybe I made mistakes too. There's no learning from that. There's no learning from what he did. He's just being ingratiated with people who hate the left and being rewarded with attention from those kinds of people. I think the same way probably Rittenhouse has been by like the Proud Boys and and these other groups who are like, yeah, man, we love you. You did the right thing. You're awesome. We support you. Of course you're going to lean into that because you feel scared and alone. And he's a kid. I mean, he's a kid. Technically adult legally, whatever. But like, you don't understand what I'm saying. He's a kid because we're all old enough now to say that when you talk about somebody who's less than half your age. And it makes me sad because he, even if he did all these things with the worst kinds of intents, it could still be something that he could learn from, and it's almost guaranteed that he won't because now he's a football for the machine to punt around basically. To keep us angry at each other. And that was sort of my top point, and that's where I'll end it. Let's get to building bridges instead, huh?
Amen.
Let's do that. But I'm going to end it here. Guys, if you're watching this, you're watching it on YouTube, please subscribe to my channel that I have resurrected from the dead. Bringing that back up. Please check us out on Facebook. Please check out the podcast feed. Fermenting Opinions, you can get it on iTunes, Beyond Pod, or wherever else you get your podcast listening on. Please do that. Haley's already left, but I thank her for joining. Warren, great having you on. Loved this conversation. Haji, always great chatting with you, man. Got to get you on a dedicated line, though, bro. And that's it, because your insights are great, but it's like you launch into it, and we're all just waiting, and it's like, oh, we lost him. And I always love the dogs, man. I hope you're doing well. Hope you're hanging in there.
I'm better.
Nothing but love for the dogs.
I can say
my co-host Molly.
Oh,
Nice.
My co-host Molly. All right. And that said, guys, I am going to call it here. Have a lovely